Welcome to the Sharp Angles Betting and DFS Show. My name is Tod Burros, and I am your host, and I am welcoming you to week 2. As always, I will be joined this year by Ryan McCrystal, and we look forward to giving you a good show and especially going over Ryan's props. Week 1 of the season was pretty good. And, with week 2, you can use the code SAVE15 to save 15% on any fantasy package. And if you want to take advantage of all of Warren's betting plays and become part of the Mustache Brigade, you can save a whopping 70% off our week 2 package. That's right. Use the code week 2 and save 70% on our weekly betting package. See what it's all about and save. Also, if you could please do me a favor and like and subscribe to both the Sharp Football YouTube page if you're watching this, or if you are a podcast listener, give us a like and a subscribe. We certainly would appreciate it. And if you check me out on Twitter at BestBallNFL and let me know that you followed us on the stream or on the podcast, I will follow you on Twitter. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Yeah, excited to dive into it. Had a pretty good week 1, and let's dive right into week 2 now.
Absolutely. I was very excited. Last week we nailed our David Montgomery prop for Thursday night. Who do you have for us for this Thursday night?
Yeah, I got 2 props for us tonight, both involving TJ Hockenson. Obviously, if you listened last week, we know that we played the over on his receptions at 4.5. We got the same line this week, and I'm once again going to be on the over on this one. Slightly different reason than last week. As you know, last week we talked a lot about how the Bucs play a lot of too high coverages and how that's favorable for opening up the middle of the field for tight ends like Hockenson. That was a big reason why we liked him last week. The Eagles are not as aggressive in their use of too high. They sort of split their defense up a little bit more evenly, sort of middle of the pack in terms of their coverage between too high, single high. But they're in the middle of the pack. They're not at the bottom. So this is still a decent matchup. And we also just have a really strong track record going here with Hockenson since he got to Minnesota. The over's hit in 8 out of 10 games so far with Minnesota. He's played 11 games, but there was no line on one of them. So an 80% on the over so far since he got there. That's a pretty good trend to go with. And we got a reason to believe this is at least a decent matchup based on the coverage. Also, the Eagles are dealing with some injuries on defense. So this definitely has the potential to be a little bit more of a faster pace, high scoring game, which, potential more possessions, maybe more opportunities for Hockenson. So once again, I like the over. However, I'm on the under on his longest receptions prop. His longest reception prop is available at 18.5. That's pretty aggressive based on the way he's been used in the offense. He sees a lot of targets. He just doesn't see a lot of targets downfield. In fact, he's hit the over on, or he's gone over this number. He's had a 19 or longer yard reception in only 2 of his 11 games with the Vikings so far. So he's not stretching the field for them by any means. In fact, last week, great usage rate, 9 targets in the game, but 5 of those were within 5 yards of the line of scrimmage, none of them more than 10 yards downfield. So he's just not being used as a guy to stretch the field. They rely on him in the short passing game a lot, and they love him there. But he's going to have to get lucky to have a really big reception. Someone's going to have to miss a tackle, basically, for that to happen. And I think, I wouldn't bet on that on a week-to-week basis. If this line is available at 18.5 consistently, this might become a trend for us where we're going to stick with him on the under. So, Todd, now still sticking with some Thursday night, I know you're kind of new to betting props and whatnot, but anything you like for us tonight?
Yeah. It's funny. There's 2 things. One, I wasn't able to find a line on. I was hoping to find like Boston Scott over 1 carry or Boston Scott over 2 carries, because everyone on Twitter is going to absolutely lose their mind when the answer at times isn't Swift or Penny, but Boston Scott. But the one that I will give out this week is I like Dallas Goedert over 48.5 yards. Um, while his reception um, prop of 4 catches last year, he had the same number of games over 4 catches as he had under. Unlike TJ Hockenson, Dallas Goedert does get targets down the field, and 9 of his 12 games last year, he exceeded the 48-yard prop that I saw. So I think Dallas Goedert over 48 yards. You've got the extra advantage of the fact that they're talking about that he got shut out last week and they need to get him the ball more. I like Dallas Goedert over 48 and a half yards. Ryan, as mentioned, I'm still new at this. What are your thoughts on my thoughts?
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I think with any of the yardage props in this game, just about, I'm going to at least have a lean on the over because I have a feeling this could be a shootout tonight. Like we said, the Eagles are banged up a little bit on defense. I think that it would make a lot of sense for Minnesota to come out pretty aggressive, try to push the tempo a little bit, throw the ball down, take some shots downfield. And like you said, that could certainly involve some shots downfield at Goddard. So yeah, that would certainly be my lean if I were going this way.
Awesome. All right, let's put both of us on the spot. Last week, we both went 0-1 in our prediction of who would win the game, but let's keep it up and try and do better this week. I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think the Vikings can make this interesting. As I said, possible shootout. So I'm going to go with Eagles 30, Vikings 24 tonight.
And I think it's also going to be the Eagles. And I think, I think that the Vikings are they won so many games close last year. And I think the Eagles realize that they have to play a lot better than they did last week. I wouldn't be shocked, Ryan, if Minnesota wins this, but I will also take the Eagles, and I will go 31-24 to just differentiate from you a slight bit. All right.
Significant difference in those two predictions, though.
I know.
I know. 6.5.
All right, let's talk about the main slate a little bit. But first one I wanted to hit you with is give me some, because week one is often pretty wild. Give me something that happened that you expected, and give me something that was unexpected that happened week one.
Yeah, so I mean, I have some answers for this, but I will preface it by saying I really try to force myself not to look at too many stats after week one, because we've spent all offseason studying these teams, and we go more in depth studying week one than any other week in the season, essentially, except maybe the Super Bowl. So we feel like we have a pretty good idea of what these teams are, and then week one happens, and the tendency it's just human nature to want to use that information and put a lot of stock in it because it's the only information they have. But I try not to look at it because that we know that is our nature to want to overemphasize what happened. And take the TJ Hockenson prop as his receptions last week, his usage as an example. We just talked about how that was a great matchup for him. We expected going into that game that he was going to see a lot of targets because of the way the Bucks played. Well, if you have Hockenson on your fantasy team, although the yardage wasn't what you want, you're certainly feeling good about him getting 9 targets in week one, right?
Absolutely.
But, what if they played a team that uses a lot of single high coverage? We would have been expecting a much lower usage rate in week one. He could have easily come out of week one with 3 or 4 targets in that game. And it has nothing to do with how the Vikings use him. It just happens to be the matchup that week. And that explains so much of what happens in week one. And so that's why I try not to look too deep into what was going on, unless it's something just completely out of the blue. I know, we said we were expecting Hockenson to get a lot of targets. If he played 50% of the snaps while healthy and saw 1 target, that would be something that would raise a lot of flags. But that's the type of thing that it would have to be really out of the blue for me to raise a red flag with it, is what I'm trying to say. So to answer your question, as far as expected, it's one of the props we gave out last week, David Montgomery's usage. And I think it's worth mentioning because it was sort of counter to what I think a lot of people were expecting. We were both in agreement last week that Montgomery is really stepping into the lead back role. He's stepping into Jamal Williams' role, and that Gibbs was there to be the complementary piece who plays in the passing game and sees, a smaller share of the touches in the backfield, the handoffs in the backfield. And that played out exactly as expected. It's only week one. That could certainly change. They talked about how Gibbs is, going to see a bigger role moving forward, and I believe them. But I do think that we were on the right track there to think that at least in the running game, Montgomery is the guy. And as far as unexpected, the biggest one that jumped out to me was Cam Akers getting 22 carries. Kyron Williams also had a big role in the game with 15 carries, and obviously they were able to run the ball that much because they built a big lead, but they didn't give Ronnie Rivers any carries despite the big lead. It seemed really odd that they would just lean on Akers, who wasn't performing whatsoever. 10 of his 22 carries went for 0 or negative yards in that game. He was terrible, despite the fact that it had no impact on the game. They cruised to a fairly easy victory despite that, but it was interesting to me that they were just running him right up the middle, right into the offensive line without anything to show for it 22 times. Even given the way the game script played out, that seems wild to me. I don't know why they didn't give Williams even more carries, or, once the game was out of hand, why didn't they work Rivers into the game a little bit? Like, we're 4 years into Cam Akers now. Like, what has he's had 1 or 2 big games, really, or maybe that's underestimated, maybe 4 or 5 big games. What are we doing here? Like, move on already.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he was in what used to be the running back dead zone, and we thought we weren't going to have a running back dead zone, but a lot of the guys in that zone, Rachaad White, Isaiah Pacheco, it turns out we might have a bit of a running back dead zone just a couple rounds later than we used to have it, where it doesn't hurt you as much. For me, the thing that happened that I expected, and the way I built a lot of my best ball teams, was I really believed Tyler Algier was going to be involved. People assigning rational thought to Arthur Smith, that they got a first round pick, that Tyler Algier would just be a change of pace guy, were sorely disappointed. And I think that's a trend that will continue. I don't think Tyler Algier is going anywhere. I made some mistakes in best ball, but that was one. Having a guy that was one of your top 5 or 6 ownerships that late be the second highest running back on the slate was a very good thing. The unexpected thing to me was Zay Flowers' usage in his first NFL game. I've never in my life seen anybody get more design touches, period, than Zay Flowers got week 1. Never mind the fact that it was week 1. And it's funny because I did read something today from John Harbaugh where he said, yes, we do want to get Zay the ball, but I wouldn't expect him to have that many. But so I don't know that that's a trend that'll continue. I think Rashad Bateman looked really good. Odell Beckham also only had a couple catches, but got a few pass interference calls down the field. I think they're going to be involved more, and I do expect Zay to be involved, especially with Dobbins out for the year, which is very not good for my best ball teams. But those are my expected and unexpected, Ryan. Let's move. Let's move on to your props for the week. Last week you were 3-2 with your props, and you mentioned that in your article, and I love the fact that you take responsibility. And I think it's always good when people keep track of their wins and their losses. The first one you have for us this week is Jahmyr Gibbs over 3.5 receptions. Boy, I love this one. I agree with you that Monty is the main guy. But I do think if you faded Gibbs like I did because of how high his ADP was, it has to make you nervous seeing just how good he really is. I love this prop. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so I haven't actually seen a line for this yet. So I'm going to say bet it at 3.5 or lower. Hopefully we get it there. I think we will based on the fact that he only had 2 catches for 18 yards last week. But I think this is a good opportunity for him to bounce back. Again, this is a matchup thing. I think this is a much better matchup for him based on what we think his role is going to be. And after having seen last week sort of play out the way we thought it would between Gibbs and Montgomery, I think we should have a little bit more confidence that we are on the right track in projecting this backfield. He's in the DeAndre Swift role, essentially. He's the pass catcher who's going to see, some carries every game, but we're focusing here, obviously, on the passing volume here. And so last year, I went back and looked at their target share, zone versus man, after the TJ Hockenson trade, because obviously that shook things up a little bit for them. And Swift last year had an 18% target share against zone coverage. That was the second highest on the team. 11% against man. That was fourth on the team. So any team that plays a lot of zone coverage is probably going to be a really good matchup for Gibbs in terms of his passing volume this year. And he's got that this week with the Seahawks. Even if we just look back at last week against the Chiefs, first of all, both of his receptions came against zone coverage. The Chiefs used zone coverage, however, on only 61% of their snaps outside the red zone. That's a little bit on the lower end of the spectrum. Seahawks last week, 92% zone coverage rate. That's right in line with what they had last year, a little bit above actually what they had last year, 86%, which is the second highest in the league last year. So this is a very high zone coverage team. Assuming we're on the right track and thinking that Gibbs kind of sticks in this DeAndre Swift role in the passing game, probably bodes really well for him to have increased volume this week against the Seahawks.
Awesome. I love that. You are also under on Deion Jackson's longest run, correct?
Yeah, the under on his longest rush against the Texans. I'm hoping this line is at 12.5 yards or higher. Maybe it comes down a little bit, but the Texans are obviously not, although they played fairly well last week, surprisingly, not known for their defense at this point. So hopefully we do get a favorable line here and we can play this. Really two main factors here. The first is the Colts offensive line. And the second is that defense is approaching the Colts. You would think that they would do everything in their power to force Anthony Richardson to throw the ball. That's the preferred action here. If you're facing this offense, make him prove that he can do it early in his career, right? So Colts, focusing on the offensive line portion of that first, Colts running backs last year, they ranked 21st in the league in their rate of gaining 3 or more yards before contact. That's a really important stat that I'll reference throughout the year when we're talking about longest rush props. And then last week against the Jaguars, Jackson had 13 carries. He did not have a single carry where he had 3 untouched yards. So if you're consistently getting hit at or behind the line of scrimmage, the odds of you breaking off a long run plummet dramatically. And as I said, the Texans defense, although I don't have a ton of confidence in saying they're going to be a good defense, but based on how they played last week, I do think that they're probably not the worst team in the league. So maybe not even in the bottom 5 in terms of run defense. They looked fairly good last week against Baltimore.
They did, and they added, a guy who many thought was the best player in the draft, and he certainly looked the part week 1. I agree with you. I mean, and Zach Moss might be back. I like that one as well. Your third one will take us out to the West Coast to a place where we get a lot of rain. Tell us about your next prop.
Yeah, I will hopefully be on the under on Geno Smith's longest completions. I'm hoping for a line of 31.5 or higher here. We'll probably get that. These longest completion props don't dip below that all that often. So I think we'll get this one. It's really all about the offensive line, the injuries they suffered last week. Unfortunately, losing Abraham Lucas to the IR, Charles Cross. I didn't see an update today, I don't think, but as of Wednesday, he was still not practicing. So at the very least, he's not going to be 100%.
I think one of them is going to be out based on what I read, and the other one might be back.
Yeah. Lucas is for sure out. He's on the IR. Cross, it's up in the air, but certainly not going to be 100%. And that seemed to affect them last week. Geno Smith was pressured on 45% of his dropbacks last week. That was higher than any game last year. And it was against the Rams. This is not a good pass rush, we don't think. Maybe this...
Other than Aaron Donald.
Maybe this will prove to be a surprising trend for them, but at least based on what we saw last year, we do not think that this is a good pass rush. And yet they had no problems working their way through the Seahawks offensive line. And so since the start of last season, 76% of Smith's passes of 25 or more yards occurred when he held the ball for at least 2.5 seconds. But because they struggled to protect him last year, they started playing a little bit, letting him get the ball out faster than usual. Over 50% of his passes were released quicker than that. And I would think that based on the injuries, coming into this week, that's probably now worked into their game plan for this game against the Lions, that we're going to see them take fewer shots downfield, use a little bit more of the quick passing game in this matchup, which could certainly work for them as far as a game plan against the Lions. But I think it really dramatically decreases the odds that he hits on a big play down the field. So I'll be on the under on Geno Smith's longest completions as long as that line is 31 or higher.
Yeah, this one I think I'll be on the other side. I think they will make a big play, but overall I'm down on Geno. So, I didn't have a lot of them in best ball. They've got 3 great receivers, but sometimes you find these guys who, if you turn a frog into a prince, it only lasts until, the magic spell is over. So maybe Geno will be good again this year, but I know down the stretch, he had some pretty telling splits between the first half where he was as good as anyone in the game, and all guys like me had to eat crow, and the second half where he came back down to earth, without the protection he's going to need, it's going to be hard to get the ball to those guys. But historically, one of them gets deep long. So I'm gonna say that I like that one, but it makes me more nervous than some of the other ones. The next one, however, the over on Nick Chubb's longest rush. I mean, you don't have to twist my arm too hard, Ryan, to take an over on Nick Chubb.
Yeah, this one, I think I owe the listeners an apology because I dropped the ball by not giving this out last week. We played it all last season, almost every week. I think there was one week where the line jumped over 20 yards and I may have chosen to stay away. I can't remember. And then it just completely slipped my mind to give it out last week. We're back on the over on Nick Chubb's longest rush, and we will stay on it, at least for the foreseeable future. He's going to have to prove to me that he's washed up before I'm going to stay away from this prop. This prop was 14-3 last year, including both games against the Steelers was on the over. I'm hoping for this line to be available at 18.5. It rarely gets above that. We did have some 19.5 last year with Chubb. And then, like I said, I think there was 1 week where maybe it got up to 20, but we rarely see these lines for running backs get up that high. Chubb is in rare air. He's up there so high that basically the books are scared to move it any higher, I guess, even though he keeps going over. The key stat here, I sort of mentioned before that gaining 3 yards or more before contact is really key. When a running back gains 15 or more yards, 79% of the time, it starts with 3 or more yards before contact. That's why this stat is so critical. And the Browns offensive line, or through a combination of Chubb's vision, I should say, and the Browns offensive line, consistently gets this. 28% of his carries last week, 3 or more yards before contact. If he's producing those kinds of numbers, he's going to consistently hit the over just like he did last year. And I should mention that Jack Conklin obviously got injured last week. That's probably a concern that some people might have regarding Chubb. But, he only had 5 carries last week while Conklin was on the field. So of those 13 carries when he had DeJuan Jones, the rookie, in place of Conklin, he picked up 3 or more yards before contact on 23% of those carries. So still at a really good rate. It's possible that there's not a huge drop off, at least in the run game, from Conklin to DeJuan Jones. And so I'm going to continue to trust Nick Chubb. You'll likely hear me give this out again next week.
Yeah, I always am reminded, I kind of like to pat myself on the back that I've been able to see certain qualities in certain people at the running back position. And I remember watching Nick Chubb tape and thinking to myself, people want to talk about long speed, which he does have. But one of the most under talked about parts of a running back is how quickly you can get to the hole. And I remember watching his tape thinking, man, for a big guy, he gets to the hole so quickly. And when you do that, if there's a hole there, you can get through the hole quicker. And so I've always been a big fan of Nick Chubb's ability to get into the open field. And then when you get into the open field and that you're that fast and that big, good things can happen. I love that prop. Let's go with the last one of the week. A guy that really most people don't like very much, but he is a pretty good pass catcher. Tell us about Najee Harris over on receptions.
Yeah, so another play for this Monday Night Football game between the Browns and Steelers. I like the over on Harris's receptions prop. This was available at 1.5 last week, which would be awesome. If it is still available at that this week, it's probably my favorite play of the week. I'll still take it if it's at 2.5, though. Maybe decrease my confidence slightly if we need 3 receptions out of him, but the logic here just makes too much sense. So I'm still going to take it. The problem is we got to trust Matt Canada. And that's a bit risky.
Oh, Canada.
Yeah.
Why can't you call a good game?
Yeah, it's brutal the way that he has structured this offense.
No Deontay Johnson. But that kind of goes in your favor as far as more likely that there'll be drop off in short passes to the running backs.
It does. The only downside of that is it might be one of the factors that pushes the line up reception because it becomes a little bit more obvious. But yeah, you're right. It certainly does increase the odds that he's more involved. The reason here is really that Kenny Pickett, what they did last week, he held the ball way too long. He got rid of the ball in 2.5 seconds or less, and only 35% of his passes. That's the second lowest rate from last week. Why on earth Canada is trusting his second-year quarterback with a mediocre to poor offensive line to hold the ball for that long? I have no idea. It's a terrible strategy. But this week against the Browns, again, especially seeing what they did.
Pickett to charge.
Yes.
Sorry.
I mean,
I love a good pun. Actually, that's more of a play on words. But go ahead.
Yeah. But, look what the Browns did to the Bengals offensive line, which certainly, at least on paper, looks like a much better unit than the Steelers. And Joe Burrow is certainly capable of processing faster than Kenny Pickett is. And they cause all kinds of problems. So I don't know how Canada could watch his own tape and tape of the Bengals-Browns game last week and think that he can come out with the same strategy. He's got to scheme up some quick, easy throws for Pickett just to get the passing game on track. And Harris is a very capable receiver. So it would seem to be a really obvious pivot for them to just get him a little bit more involved in the passing game, just build some confidence in Pickett, throw some screens to sort of counter that pass rush that the Browns had that worked so well last week. They obliterated the Bengals offensive line. Joe Burrow got rid of the ball in 2.5 seconds or less on 74% of his plays. Compare that to Pickett's 35%. And yet the Browns still pressured him 36% of the time. So like I said, you cannot look at those two games and think that Pickett is going to be able to just hang in the pocket and throw downfield. So I think this, but like I said, I'll take it at 1.5. Hopefully if it's at 2.5, I'll still take it. It's not going to be at 3.5. If it were, I might stay away. But if he has a 4, 5, 6 receptions, it wouldn't shock me because that's such an obvious, pivot for them to make for this offense in this matchup. So I don't know. I know you're probably going to say you're not high on him for DFS, but it might make him a sneaky good DFS play this week if they do make that transition. So,
well, they did talk about transitioning more to Jaylen Warren. So I won't be playing Najee Harris for DFS this or most likely any week, but that doesn't mean he can't get the over on this prop, right? I do like the prop. So I do want to call out Terrell T in the chat. He had 2 questions. The first one was Dotson or Addison PPR. I'm not a big Addison guy. I'm gonna go with Dotson there. And then the other question was Boston Scott tonight. I'm playing one lineup in DFS tonight. I'm not a captain mode guy, but I'm putting my man Rashad Penny in the captain spot. And because I do think, and we've already talked about it, that Boston Scott might be more involved than people think tonight. But I know that Rashad Penny has the ability to break the long one. And he's not going to be heavily owned in the captain spot because of the uncertainty. I would rather bet on Rashad Penny than Boston Scott. Thoughts on either one of those, Ryan?
Not a lot of thoughts on the Eagles backfield. I prefer to avoid that conversation. But for Dotson and Addison, I'll actually go against you on that one. I think I would lean towards Addison. I think we talked in the offseason. I'm also a little bit skeptical of Addison as far as like his season-long projection. But I already mentioned at the top that I think that this Thursday night game has the potential to be pretty high scoring. The over-under on it is 48.5 compared to 39 for the Commanders game this week against Denver. That's a pretty big difference. So the odds of Addison playing in a shootout, getting a lot more opportunities, getting more scoring opportunities, pretty good this week. So this in this particular comparison, I would probably side with Addison.
All right, fair enough.
All right, so I already brought up DFS with Najee Harris, tried to throw out an off the wall suggestion there, maybe to consider on Monday night. But let's transition to the DFS conversation now. Let's start with players, Todd, that you're thinking about fading this week.
Well, I mean, let's go position by position, and I'll give you, just like you sometimes have the over and sometimes the under. I'm sometimes going to be on a guy and sometimes off a guy. How's that sound?
Sounds good. So then let's start with quarterbacks.
All right. So for me, I love this Jacksonville Chiefs game. Right now, I mean, I want to get an updated ownership because it changes as the week goes on. But right now it looks like Josh Allen and then Mahomes are the two highest owned. Lawrence has moved up to number 3, but Lawrence is my favorite play of the week. I think that this is a game that could really blow up. And if Mahomes is half the ownership of Josh Allen, I'll also have some Mahomes. But I just love Trevor Lawrence's weapons. He's 6,700. You can get unique by playing 2 of the 3 guys. Trevor Lawrence is a quarterback that I'm on this week. And I'll give you a couple low price guys that I'm considering. One is Brock Purdy at 5,700. 2 of the most owned players of the week right now are Deebo Samuel and Christian McCaffrey. And Christian McCaffrey catches passes as well as runs. With that in mind, 5,700 Brock Purdy becomes interesting to me because he has low ownership. And then the other low guy, it's really ugly, especially more ugly because it looks like DeAndre Hopkins might miss, but 3% ownership or less on Ryan Tannehill against a bad defense at $5,000. Tannehill, in the past, a couple years ago, had some really monster games. He looked terrible last week, but that would be my low. If I'm going to, last week I had a Mac Jones double stack that ended up 1,400 in the Millie Maker, and it would have been a lot higher if I didn't have Mike Williams on the roster. And both my running backs in that lineup were not the best. So I like taking a couple shots on these really low-owned stacks. I will keep that one in mind at the quarterback position, Ryan.
Yeah, I don't hate that Tannehill suggestion either, because if you just think about how that game plays out, I could definitely see that being a game where maybe it's kind of close early, Chargers pull away, and then, late in the second half, the Titans kind of have to start to throw it. And with it not being a great Chargers defense, they could have some success doing that. So maybe he does pad his stats late and could end up with a surprisingly good fantasy line there. I could definitely
even early, historically, the play action off of the Derrick Henry runs.
Yep.
Just because it didn't happen last week, Chig could have a big game.
Yeah, I could definitely see that playing out. All right, let's jump into the running backs now.
Running back, I'm going to start by fading Rachaad White. Somehow he played awful. Everyone talks about how inefficient he is. And yet, last I looked, he was looking at 20% ownership. No thank you for me. Also, Joe Mixon, one of the most high-owned running backs of the week against the Baltimore Ravens, who are a very good run defense. I would much rather play, if I'm going to play the Bengals this week, I'm much more likely to play Burrow on a bounce back week with Jahmyr Chase or T. Higgins rather than Joe Mixon. I really like Kenny Walker this week. He got the workload that we had hoped he would. And, we know he's a big play machine. He didn't have one last week. I think Kenny Walker right now at low ownership is a good DFS play. My favorite play of the week, though, is Josh Jacobs. Josh Jacobs had the same workload he had last year, but it wasn't a Josh Jacobs week. It was a wide receiver week with Jacoby Myers going off. Jacoby is going to miss this week. Josh Jacobs is at 7,100 and under 10% ownership right now, hovering right around 10%. Last year, Josh Jacobs was up almost around 9,000, and this is his second week. If this ownership holds, I will be well over on Josh Jacobs. Low price guys, I always like to throw out a low price guy. The only one I'm really considering is part of that Jacksonville game, Jerick McKinnon at 4,700. If that game turns into a track meet, we could definitely see Jerick McKinnon. We've seen him have big games. Those are my running backs, Ryan. Any thoughts on them?
Yeah, I like the Jacobs suggestion. Going up against the Bills is pretty heavy underdogs. It's certainly, it would certainly make sense for them to lean into the run game a little bit more, and the running back passing game as sort of an extension of the run game. So certainly it would make sense for them to come into that game with the game plan of getting him a little bit more involved. Let's jump into the wide receiver discussion now.
Let's stay right at the Ravens. Last year, one of Jacobs or, a rule in optimizers, one of Jacobs or Adams in every lineup was a very, very good thing until they both got so expensive last year. I think that is fully in play right now, looking at 10% ownership on Devontae Adams with Jacoby Myers out. I am going to probably have one of Devontae Adams or Josh Jacobs in each lineup, because the chance of one of them hitting 30 points is pretty darn good, I think. I am fading Jaden Reed at 3,400 with heavy ownership. If I need to go that low, I don't want 25% on a guy, or 22% is what I saw. I'd rather go with Tank Dell, who looks like he is going to be in for a bigger workload with the injury to Noah Brown. And he was the one wide receiver other than Robert Woods that actually, he looked pretty good when they did throw it to him. Nico Collins, I also like. And the other low price guy, Josh Downs. He's kind of I've always thought of him kind of as a discount Zay Flowers. If I need to go low, they definitely got him the ball. He's in the game. He is that third wide receiver. If I need salary savings, I'm much more likely to take a 2% owned Josh Downs than a 22% Jaden Reed. And finally, Calvin Ridley is just still too cheap at 7,200. He looked like an alpha last week. And I will also throw out, everyone's down on Christian Kirk. People forget, Ryan, and you don't, because you already mentioned it, is that, you don't want to take too much out of week one. Christian Kirk is a big play waiting to happen. If he's going to be low owned, I am certainly going to mix up all the Jags weapons this week in a game against the Kansas City Chiefs.
Yeah, I love your suggestion of the Jags receivers. I feel like, especially with Kirk not having a huge game, that seems almost like an obvious target, with that game likely being high scoring. And people are probably, when they want exposure to that game, obviously they're going to be drawn to Mahomes, Lawrence,
Kelsey's back.
Kelsey, Ridley. Like, there's some really big names in that game that everyone's going to be drawn to. And it seems completely plausible that Kirk just puts up a huge number in that one. So that make a ton of sense.
And what you can do, someone I used to work with at another site used to do, if you take a 25% owned player and you mix him with a 15% quarterback, that combination is probably going to be owned, maybe 17, 18%, I mean, 15, it's got to be less than 15% because the quarterback's only 15%. And then you just stick in one more player on that team, and typically that gets ownership down into the 2 to 3% range. I think Christian Kirk is a great way to do that this week. And when we get to tight end, I've got one more name for that.
All right, let's dive into it then. Tight ends, what do you got?
My favorite this week, and I can't believe as a Giant fan I'm saying this, is Evan Engram. Engram looked great. I watched that game. Engram is, it's going to be different. It could be Zay Jones one week. It could, it's not a tight offense, which is tougher for DFS. We like those offenses where there's only 2 or 3 weapons, but if you're playing, a number of lineups, I'll probably play about 50 this week. I would rather play more of that Jags Chiefs game and mix it up than I would, I have a tendency to get too widespread because the fear of missing out. And the other tight end, and I'm going to finish up with this one. I love Jake Ferguson this week. He's got low ownership. He had 6 targets in a game where they didn't have to throw the ball. They're facing a fierce pass rush this week against the Jets. Now it looks like Brandon Cooks might miss. If Jake Ferguson stays under 5% owned, I will have at least 20% Jake Ferguson. I think he's one of my most owned best ball tight ends. And nothing that happened week 1, Ryan, made me, even though I didn't get the points or the results that I wanted, I certainly got the usage that I was looking for.
Yeah, I like that you brought up Ingram. That's another one that I'm on as well. The Chiefs, we talked about with Hockenson how 2 high coverages can open up the middle of the field for tight ends. Well, last year outside the red zone, no one used 2 high coverage more often than the Chiefs. So that is potentially a significant factor. Now, that rate dropped a lot last week, somewhat surprisingly. So maybe they're shaking things up this year. There's a little bit of risk of that, but this could be a really good matchup for Ingram based on what we saw last year from the Chiefs coverage.
Yep. To sum up, I love the Jags this week. I mean, we've talked about them being an ascending offense. They've certainly got the weapons. The running game is good, but not great. ETN, he's going to have some flash plays, but, him and Bigsby are okay, but the passing game is dynamic. And there's just too many ways for this to be a 60-point game for me. I'm really surprised that so far ownership is not out of hand on this game. If it continues, a lot of my DFS money will be on the Jags Chiefs this week. All right. I think that is going to do it for this episode. To sum up, Ryan is on TJ Hockenson tonight, with both over on receptions and under on his the 18.5 yards per reception. He is over on Jahmyr Gibbs, under on Deion Jackson's longest run, under on Geno's longest pass, over on Nick Chubb's longest rush, and over on Najee Harris's receptions. Ryan, I wish you well with your props this week, and I look forward to getting together next week with you.
Thanks. We'll do it again next week.
All right, that's going to do it, folks. Don't forget to go to the Sharp Football YouTube page if you're watching this now. Like it, and also make sure to like and subscribe to the podcast. And Ryan and I will see you next week.